All right, good morning, everybody. David Cobb here. I appreciate your logging in this morning for our May edition of the Understanding Our Wildlife webinar series. So with that, our presentation today is by Gabriella Garrison. She is our Eastern Piedmont Habitat Conservation Coordinator in our Habitat Conservation Division. And her presentation, her discussion is native bees in North Carolina, what do we know? So with that, Gabriella, I'll let you share your screen and take the presentation.
Well, thanks everybody for joining me this morning. I'm going to talk about native bees today and some of the research that we're doing on our game lands in North Carolina. And anybody that knows me relatively well will know that I love to talk about bees and I can do it for hours, but I'm going to try really hard to keep it to 30 or 40 minutes today. So let's see if I can advance my slide. There we go. All right, so just a little bit of background in pollinator diversity in North Carolina. We have over 550 species of native bees, and the last count that I saw was 561, but it kind of depends on who you're speaking with on what that count is. So a safe bet to say is over 500 or over 550. We have over 2,800 species of moths in North Carolina, so really diverse, and that number does kind of vary quite a bit. And I think there are probably still species of moths out there that haven't been documented. We have 177 species of butterflies, one bird, our hummingbird, and then really this vast unknown number of other insect pollinators to include wasps and flies and beetles and things like that that just haven't been looked at really closely and documented well. So you might be asking, what is our role in all of this? What is WRC's role? Well, there are 457 species of greatest conservation need in our state wildlife action plan. And of those 457, 44 are insects. And of those 44 insects, 25 are pollinators, to include bees, butterflies, and moths. And so really one of the biggest gaps in native bees is that we just don't know very much at all. We know some about their life history, their life cycle, and I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit, but we really don't know what their population levels are like. We know that they're declining and we know what the causes of decline are, but we just need to have more information. We need to know what's on our landscape. And so that's what prompted some of the research that we started conducting a few years ago. And that fits really nicely into our conservation actions, what we need: more surveys, more monitoring, more research, and then more restoration and protection of habitats. And we're already doing that. A lot of our biologists are on the ground. We're putting in pollinator habitat. We're creating or maintaining or restoring early successional habitat. And we're really trying to pay attention to the floral diversity that these pollinators, that these insects need to survive, as well as the habitat for their nesting, which we're going to talk about that also in just a moment. But before I go any further, I just want to make a really quick clarification, because I think oftentimes people will lump honeybees and native bees all into one group. And even though they're all bees, they're actually really quite different. So this is a really elementary level. So if you know all this, then just hang on with me for a minute. But honeybees, of course, are non-native. They're from Europe, they're from Asia. They nest in hives. And so in a hive, you can typically have thousands potentially of bees. And they have this very complex social structure, right? And the hive persists from year to year. Well, with native bees, they are ground and cavity nesters. So there's no hives. Bumblebees have these colony type structures, but they're not really close structured to hives. 90% of our native bees are solitary. They're ground nesters, or they nest in stems or twigs or wood, things like that. And they have an annual life cycle. So they'll emerge in the spring, and then by fall, they'll die, and the next generation will be cooking over the winter. And bumblebees are a little bit different in that the queen, she will persist. She'll overwinter. She'll hibernate in a little hole in the ground or a little burrow somewhere where she's protected over the winter. And then her whole colony, though, will die in the fall. She'll emerge next spring and she'll start a new colony. So just as kind of an interesting aside in this concept that people lump native bees and honeybees together all the time, my daughter brought this seed packet home from school the other day from elementary school. And she was really excited about planting the flowers. And I looked at it and I turned over the seed packet because, of course, my first thought is, oh, I wonder what the flowers are in the seed packet. And there's this one little line here that I highlighted because it caught my attention. Restore beneficial habitat when planting this honeybee mix specifically formulated to support native bees. Well, that to me is lumping everything together. And when I see honeybee mixes, the flowers are usually actually quite different than the flowers that we try to grow for native bees. Honeybees or beekeepers, they like to plant a lot of clovers. Honeybees love clovers. They'll plant a lot of annual species like poppies and cosmos and things like that. And with native bees, we have a lot of specialist native bees that like or only will forage on very specific plant species. And even the more generalist bees, they still really tend to gravitate towards certain families or genera of flowers. So it's really interesting to me that things are often lumped together. And, we're grateful for our honeybees because they've really shed light on the importance of pollinator conservation. But there is a little bit of a divide between honeybees and native bees. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about native bees before we get into the research that we've been conducting. I really like this picture. Let's see my pointer going. This is a poster, and it's a really cool poster because I really think it illustrates how diverse native bees are. So you have the really large carpenter bee over here, and then you have these really small little sweat bees down here. Bumblebees, mining bees. I mean, there's bees that have long tongues, bees that have short tongues, green bees, yellow bees, striped abdomen bees. They differ in where they carry pollen. Some carry pollen on their abdomen, some carry it on their legs. So there's just really great diversity. And interestingly, a lot of people don't know bees are actually descended from wasps. And so sometimes you'll hear an entomologist maybe call a bee a vegetarian wasp, because millions of years ago, when wasps were foraging on insects, at one point, a wasp started foraging on nectar, and that's where our bee tree broke off. And so that leads me to the next point. Bees gather pollen to feed their brood. They'll forage on nectar and they gather pollen to feed the young that are going to be developing. And so the nectar is mixed in with the pollen to kind of create this little pollen ball. And in my next slide, I believe there'll be a picture of what that looks like. But the nectar is really rich in carbohydrates and amino acids, and the pollen is that protein component. So when you mix it all together in this pollen ball, it's really this great source of forage for the developing young. And so another great thing about native bees that I think a lot of people don't know is that they are actually more efficient pollinators than honeybees are. And let's talk about that. So if ample natural habitat is present, native bees can provide most, maybe even all, of the pollination services needed for crops. So as an example, 1 acre of apples would take roughly about 250 mason bees to pollinate, whereas it could take 2 hives of honeybees. And remember, I said in a hive, it can have thousands of honeybees. So you're potentially talking about 2,000 or 3,000 honeybees where it would only take 250 mason bees to pollinate. So that's a pretty big difference. Most species of native bees are active in cooler, rainy conditions. So we've had some cooler temperatures overnight these last couple nights, at least I have in my neck of the woods. And when I've woken up in the morning, it's been a little bit on the chillier side, but I'll start seeing some of our bumblebees and other things flying around looking for flowers. And it's a while before I see the honeybees come out. They like it much warmer. They like it much sunnier. They don't like the rain. And oftentimes after a rain, I'll see bumblebees. They're right back on a flower, and they look like a shaggy wet dog, but they're on a flower right away. Another really cool thing about native bees is that some species, especially bumblebees, are capable of buzz pollination. So they use their flight muscles, their indirect flight muscles, they grab onto the flower and they vibrate it really, really strongly, and it shakes the pollen loose from the anthers, from the flower's anthers, and it releases all the pollen at once. And I oftentimes have a video that I'll show. I didn't today because I don't want to use up that time, but it's a really cool video that shows how that happens, and it does it in slow motion, and it shows the release of pollen, and it's really cool. So if you have a few minutes and you want to jump onto YouTube, Google bee buzz pollination, and you'll pull up some really fun videos that shows how that happens. So before I go on, let's just take a second to talk about the life cycle of a solitary bee, because most of our bees are solitary, right? So up here, here is the bee that's foraging on a flower, gathering pollen and nectar. And this piece right here is a really short part of their life cycle, but this is really the only part of their life cycle that we see. And so below ground, about 90% or so, or not 90, I'm sorry, about 70% of our solitary bees are ground nesters. And so what you're going to see if you see a bee gathering pollen and nectar and it's collecting on their legs or under their abdomen, that's more likely a female. And so she'll go and she'll find a nice piece of dirt that doesn't have grass on it and that is pretty well drained soil. And she'll excavate a little burrow, a little tunnel like this. And she will build this pollen ball, which again is made of pollen and nectar, and she'll deposit it here. And this ball right here, that is a lot of trips back and forth to the flower. So that's just not 1 or 2 trips to the flower. We're talking like 50 or 60 trips to the flower, any flower, to gather enough pollen and nectar to make this ball. So once this ball is complete, then she'll lay an egg on it. And that's what this is right here. The egg will develop into a larva. The larva will pupate. And while the larva is developing, it eats all of this pollen ball to get to the pupa stage. And then this stage will just kind of hang on for the rest of the year. So depending on the species of bee that you're talking about, so for instance, mining bees, they might only be up on the surface for 2 or 3 weeks. And then they'll go back down. So the egg will be cooking, well, the larva and the pupa will be cooking for the rest of the year. So let's say that I saw a mining bee come up 2 weeks ago. The female's been busy, she's been laying eggs. Well, after about 2 or 3 weeks, she dies. She's done her job. And so the egg will hatch, the larva will develop, it'll pupate, and it's just going to hang out in that stage all the way until next year. So again, it kind of varies between species, but that's generally how things work. The adult's above ground for a couple of weeks, does their business, the adult dies, and then the egg and the larva and the pupa all go through those stages and they stay underground until next year. So I really like this image here on the left because it sort of depicts what I was just talking about. And so each egg, so these little yellow balls, those are the pollen balls. And so each egg has its own little room for it to develop throughout the year. And this picture on the right, a lot of times we get calls. I just got a call from somebody actually in Fayetteville who had all of these little burrows in his front yard, and he was freaking out because there were bees coming up from it and they were flying over the holes, and he thought that they were yellow jackets. Well, a yellow jacket, if you look here on the right, you're going to have a lot of insects flying in and out of one hole. And they have that nest to defend. So they're going to be a little bit feistier. That's where they're going to come and sting you to defend this nest. Well, this female, she is not defensive in that sense because she lays her eggs and then she's done. So she never meets her young. She doesn't have anything to defend. She just has this one hole. And so if you're walking around and you see a bee going in and out of this hole, you probably have some kind of mining bee, you might have a chimney bee, you might have a sweat bee. And even though they're solitary nesters, they'll put their holes all together into these little aggregations and they'll fly around the holes. And it looks like they're social, but they're not. They each have one little hole that they use, but they like to hang out. They like to put all these holes together. So an example of some of our ground nesters are, like I said, mining bees, cellophane bees, which are also called plaster bees, and sweat bees. So I hope somebody or some folks have questions about that because I feel like that was about as clear as mud. Okay, so the other 30% of our bees, if they're not ground nesters, what are they? Well, they're either cavity nesters or they nest in stems or wood, like our carpenter bees. Leafcutter bees, people seem to know what leafcutter bees are. They nest in hollow stems. So if you see bee hotels, right, the little kind of birdhouse looking things, and they have all the little tubes in it, those are bee hotels for some of our stem nesters, like mason bees, like leafcutter bees. They will cut little pieces of leaves and bring them back to the nest, and they'll line their nest with those leaves, and they'll make these partitions, and each egg has its own room. So this is the pollen ball. And this is a larva that's developing and has almost eaten all the pollen ball. And this guy over here, he's already in the pupa stage. And so they'll cook all throughout the year and through the winter, just like the bees that were nesting underground. And then in the spring, they'll emerge again. Now, leafcutter bees, they tend to stay out a little longer than 1 or 2 weeks. I tend to see them throughout, June, July, August. And there's a lot of different species of leafcutter bees. The mason bees are earlier springtime bees. And then this picture in the middle, these are our bumblebees. And so I told you before that they're one of our few bees that have this social structure. It's not quite as complex as a honeybee, but the queen will emerge in the spring. She'll already have mated the past fall. And when she emerges, the first thing that she's going to do is look for forage. She'll look for pollen, she'll look for nectar for herself, and then she's going to look for a place where she can start her new colony. And the really cool thing about bumblebees is that they are opportunistic. They will put their nest in a bluebird box. They'll put their nest in a rodent burrow because they like that warm fur that the mice or rats or whatever have left behind. Sometimes they'll even just stick their nest under a big pile of leaves as long as it's protected. And they'll create what's called wax pots, which is what these are. That's where they'll store the nectar and the pollen, and that's where the young will develop. In bumblebee colonies, the most that they'll probably have as far as bumblebees is maybe 150 to 200. And the queen, she will lay workers, and they're all females, and they will exist throughout the whole season. And then the colony will die off in the fall. All right, so I'm going to give you a little quiz. I know that nobody can speak, but this is a quiz to see if you can tell the difference between a carpenter bee or a bumblebee, because there's always confusion around these two because they look similar, but once you can learn the identifiable features, I think you'll be able to tell the difference. So I'm going to give you just a second to look at these pictures and figure out which one is the carpenter bee and which one is the bumblebee, and then I'll tell you the answer. Time check. All right, so if you said that the bumblebee was the bee on the left, then you are correct. So like I said, they're colonial. They can have upwards of hundreds of bees. Typically, it's around 150 to 200 bees. They're opportunistic, like I just mentioned. And the most identifiable feature between bumblebees and carpenter bees are their abdomens. If you look at this guy, he's got a really furry, kind of hairy abdomen. And if you look at this guy, see how shiny it is? Size is not the best representation because carpenter bees can be small, they can be big. Queen bumblebees can be huge. So size is never a good one to go by. Coloration, not so much either, just because sometimes, the thorax on a bee can be light yellow or dark yellow, so it's very variable, but the abdomen is the best clue because carpenter bees are always going to have very shiny abdomens. And if you want an even closer look, male carpenter bees have a white plate on their face, and males can't sting. No male bee can sting, only females can sting. So if you see a carpenter bee hanging around in your face, because they really like to do that, and it has a white plate, then you know you're looking at a male carpenter bee. All right, so the importance of pollinators to agriculture. I think we all know that. You have your squash bee, blueberry bee, bumblebee, all very important bees for agriculture. If you took these bees away, then that's what your produce section would look like, pretty bleak. And this is a list of some of the food that was removed when you took away those pollinators. So these are everyday fruit and vegetable items that, I think we've come to really depend on. And there are some countries on the other side of the globe that have lost so many pollinators that they're having to go out into their farm fields and hand pollinate, which is pretty depressing, the thought of not having any bees and you have to hand pollinate your vegetables. We talk a lot about the importance of pollinators to agriculture, but what about the importance of pollinators to wildlife? Well, almost 80% of flowering plants across the globe rely on pollinators. So as an example, I wanted to just pull out a few examples. Cherries, that's one of our really, really valuable wildlife species, right? 84 species of birds feed on their fruits. 40 mammals at least feed on their fruits and other plant parts. And then just as an aside, 456 Lepidopteran species use Prunus species as larval host plants. It's a huge number. Another example, dogwoods 93 bird species feed on the drupes, and at least 20 species of mammal feed on the drupes and other plant parts as well. And for dogwoods, there are 118 lepidopterans that will use dogwoods for larval host plants. So there's a lot of benefit to having these pollinators that are keeping our plants, our flowering plants going. Lots of other examples: persimmon, sumac, wax myrtle, vaccinium chokeberry. When I'm out in the woods, I see a lot of bees on these plants, quite a few. So just one last example of the importance of pollinators to wildlife. This is something I was walking, this was several months ago, it was over the winter. I was walking behind my house in the woods and I saw this really big hole. And I saw all of these, the yellow arrows that I'm pointing to, it looked like kind of this comb nesting material. And I got a closer look and it was a yellow jacket nest that had been dug up. And so these poor yellow jackets were flying around. It was pretty chilly. I think it was December, but the nest had just been annihilated. And so just in case you don't know, there are lots of species of wildlife that do that, that will dig into the ground of wasp nests and eat the larvae because the larvae are loaded with protein. And as another example, I used to have the cedar swing set, and the carpenter bees were getting in the swing set. I'm sure most people have a story of carpenter bees having gotten into their deck, into their house, into their fence, whatnot. And so not only had the carpenter bees gotten into the swing set, but the pileated woodpeckers had come down and were blowing out all the holes where the carpenter bees had gotten just to eat the carpenter bee larvae. So the larvae has a huge role with the amount of protein it has for feeding lots of species of wildlife. And you know, with these mammals, they have such thick fur, such thick coats. I'm sure that the stinging wasp must not bother them. And there's also got to be a benefit to doing it in December when there's a lot less activity on account of the cold. With the wasps, they're going to be a little slower to respond. So, okay, I've talked about a little bit of a background on native bees, and so let's jump into the native bee sampling project that we've been working on the game lands. And so the idea behind this was to figure out what our native bees were on our game lands, because like I said, we just know so little about bees because they're only above ground or out of their stems for a really short amount of time during the year. So it's really hard to gauge what we have, who's there, what might be declining. And so we wanted to figure out diversity, but we also wanted to figure out the role of prescribed fire and native bees. Just because prescribed fire is such a commonly used habitat management technique, we felt like there was a gap in understanding and how that might be affecting our native bees. There are some studies out there that talk about the effect of fire, but a lot of them are studies from wildfires and they're out west. And so the ecosystem is a little different and the fire intensity is different. So we thought that adding in prescribed fire to the study might be beneficial. And we're hoping that once we get the results at the end of the study, it will help us make more informed land management decisions. So we, with limited funding and limited personnel, we knew that we weren't going to be able to get on the ground everywhere. So we decided to pick one game land per region of the state, with the Sandhills counting as one of those regions. And based on historic data and information from the Museum of Natural Sciences and from NC State, we were able to gather these historic hotspots. And so this is how we chose where we sampled. And so in the mountains, we chose Sandy Mush over here. And then of course, Sandhills Game Lands in the Sandhills, Butner Falls and Neuse Game Land in the Piedmont. And then on the coastal plain, we started at Holly Shelter the first year, but then we shifted to Neuse River Game Lands the second year, and I'll talk about that more in just a little bit. And so then just some really quick background. This study was actually organized through the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance Research Committee. And if you don't know about the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance, the next slide will clue you in on that. But our pilot year was actually 2019. But because of some logistical challenges, we weren't able to start until June. But if you're out in the woods and you're out there in March and April, you know that you're seeing bees out there. And sometimes, because the weather is so wonky, sometimes you'll even see bees in February. So in 2020, we counted that as our first complete year because we were able to get out at the very beginning of April. And then this first year, too, 2019, we were also having some challenges at Sandy Mush. We didn't have kind of consistent personnel out there. Another partner organization was helping us. So we had fewer site visits and fewer areas that we covered. So we had less bees collected at that point. But this just gives you an overview. So even though we were out in 2019, we don't count our first complete year until 2020. And like I said, the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance, we are a partner organization that we founded in 2018. We're founded in 2018. And this is a list down here of all of the organizations that are participants in this partnership. All common interest in pollinator conservation and outreach. And we had 6 committees that we formed to include outreach, energy, plant resources, habitat assessment, pesticide stewardship, and research. And each committee, as you can see, kind of has its own little niche of different things that they do. But this particular study that I'm getting ready to talk about was conceived in the research committee. And we have several folks from NC State and UNCG, so we had our academic component well represented there. All right, so as we were thinking about this study, there were some things that were crossing our mind that we wanted to look at. Not necessarily some things that we were going to be able to look at specifically in the study because it's a small study, but just some things that we're starting to think about, right? And so first, is there a difference between 2 and 3 year burn intervals? So depending on where you are across the state, some managers burn every 2 years, some every 3 years, some are a mix of 2 and 3 years. Up in the mountains, it's more like 4 or 5 years. So we really wanted to hone in on where that sweet spot was that would really benefit pollinators, especially bees, the most. Then how does burn block size influence response? And this is something that we may or may not be able to get a hold on specifically within our organization because we have, parameters that we have to observe and we have acreage that we have to get at the end of each year. But there is something to be considered just because, you have really large bees like bumblebees and carpenter bees that may be able to fly several miles. So if you have a really large area that you burned, they may be able to get to an area that has forage, but you also have really small bees that may only fly 50 feet from their nest, right? So if you have this really large 500-acre block that you're burning, are you basically cutting out those bees because they can't travel far enough to get to the next area of forage? So those are things that we're trying to think about. What, again, is the sweet spot for the right block size to burn? Like I mentioned, there are not very many studies that have investigated how prescribed burning impacts bees. There are some studies looking at wildfires, and there are some studies out west, but we were really excited to be able to bring this home to North Carolina. And then really this is a key thought. As time progresses and we learn more bees are likely to get federally listed. So knowing what we have on our landscape is really important. It's critical. Okay, so let's talk about methodology here. In 2020, our first official sampling season, we started in April, we went through October, and we had our 3 sites per game land. So we had 4 game lands, right? And 3 sites per game land, so a total of 12 sites across the state. Our plot A was just burned that year, last year. Our plot B was burned in 2019, and our plot C was burned in 2018. And ideally, we wanted to look at growing season burns, but that wasn't possible at all sites across the state, so we just rolled with what we could. And again, just to keep reiterating, 2019 we have data for, but we're not necessarily counting that as a full season just because we lacked those 2 really important months where we see a lot of bee diversity and we had logistical challenges up in the mountains, but it's still data. And the idea behind doing this study is that it's going to be a 3-year study. So we're going to work our way through a whole 3-year burn rotation. So last year was our first year, this year is our second year, and then 2022 will be our last year. And the sites are all the same. So we'll be able to see what each site looks like at a different interval of burn. All right, so expounding a little bit more on the methodology. So we are out every 2 weeks from the beginning of April to the end of October. And at each site, we put out 30 bee bowls. And this is a bee bowl right here. It's just a little cup. And it was in 3 different colors, blue, yellow, and white. and they were spaced just like this. They were spaced 5 meters apart, and we had them on stands that were about a foot above the ground. And in recently burned areas, that really wasn't an issue, but in areas that hadn't been burned in 2 years, where there was a lot more vegetation, we were just trying to get the cups kind of above that vegetation a little bit. So we placed them out in the morning. We filled them with soapy water so that there would be no surface tension. So if things fell in there, they wouldn't be able to get out. And then we collected the bowls in the late afternoon and stored them in ethanol. And then that same day, while we put out our bee bowls, while the bee bowls were sitting out during the day attracting insects, we would net at all of those sites. We net at the morning for 30 minutes, and then we net in the afternoon for 30 minutes. So that's a total of 6 netting sessions throughout the day. And then we would take those, put the insects, the bees in little vials, and put those in the freezer. This is a little bit of what our data looks like. This is one of the vial. This is a metallic sweat bee, green metallic sweat bee. This is our data sheet. Every bee had its own individual number. We were collecting data as far as time, the weather, what plant the bee was caught on, so that everything could be correlated together and back to that one bee. And then there's been a lot of lab processing. A lot of, with the bees that were netted, those can be pinned pretty readily, but with the bees that are being stored in ethanol, they have to be cleaned and dried and that kind of thing before they can be pinned. So we made pretty good headway on our 2019 samples. And then last year when COVID hit, NC State kind of shut everything down. And so we weren't able to get into the lab to do a lot of the processing, but we're hoping that things are starting to open back up now and we can really put a dent in 2020 because we've only got most of our 2019 data processed. This is an example of the spreadsheet, the database where all of the data goes. So you can see we have GPS coordinates, the county, the date, what flower the bee was caught on, the time, the weather, and who caught the bee. Lots of information, and each bee that was caught has that information associated with it. So, like I said, we have we've collected and identified, processed and identified most of the bees for 2019. We are missing that crucial spring data. So I wanted to show you some data, but you have to keep in mind that the diversity is going to be a little less than it should be, just because in a lot of areas, especially the coastal plain and the sandhills, sometimes we get our biggest bursts of diversity in those spring months. And so I promised David that I would try not to use too many genus and species, but with bees, they don't have common names like, for instance, birds do. So there are over 500 species of bees. Bumblebees all have their own name, but most other bees, they're just called sweat bees or their scientific name. And so in this image here, I wrote out, so the Halictidae, those are your sweat bees. There are 133 species of sweat bees in North Carolina. So it makes sense that a large portion of what was found at each site were some kind of sweat bee. Well, the Epidae, they are honeybees, bumblebees, carpenter bees, longhorn bees. So there's a fair amount of diversity as well. Several species of parasitic cuckoo bees. So that made a pretty good chunk at some of the sites in particular. The Callididae, those are your plaster or cellophane bees, your yellow-faced bees. It's kind of a smaller group. Those are also more springtime occurring bees, which explains why we're not seeing many of them. And then the megachiles in purple here, those are your leaf-cutting bees and your mason bees. Those are also a fair number of your parasitic bees as well. So I would expect to have seen more of those in the mountains, but you can see here that we have far less dates where we were able to get out in the mountains than we were in the other regions of the state. Interestingly, though, even though there were fewer dates in the mountains, there was more diversity in the mountains. So it has really excited us to see what 2020 data looks like, because for 2020, we were able to get out the whole season consistently every 2 weeks. And before I progress on some interesting things that we saw in 2019, I just want to stop for a minute and really acknowledge too the folks that have been helping with this study. So of course, I do the work in the Sandhills. That's where I am in the Sandhills. But in the mountains, our first year, we didn't have WRC help. We had help from another partner. But in 2020 and currently, we have Joe Tomshow and David Stewart helped us last year. They're doing all the work up there. In the Piedmont, we have Chris Baranski and Olivia Munzer doing the work. And on the coastal plain, Richie Clark. So it's a lot of work. It's a really long field day. So big thoughts of appreciation to those folks who are out there on the ground doing this work so we can get all of this data. All right, so I'm going to end by talking about a few interesting things that we've seen. And this is again all 2019 because this is our most solid data set. We're still sort of trying to figure out 2020 and get in the lab and work on some of those. But on the Sandhills in 2019, we netted this one species, no common name, but it's a type of ground nesting resin bee called Trichusa reddingsii. And the really cool thing about this bee is that it's really rare. And when we first caught it, we thought that it might be a state record. And I don't think it actually is a state record. There were some other records of this bee occurring, but they're very rare. And according to Sam Droege, anybody that knows Sam Droege knows that he's a very well-known, noted bee expert. I was going to say in the country, but really across the globe, he's well known. And he said that this bee's presence is an indication of a healthy landscape. So my first thought was, well, great, we're doing something right. We're managing the landscape well so that this bee is existing. But on the flip side, you could also look at it, well, why aren't we seeing more of these bees? Why aren't we catching a lot more of these bees? So I try to think of it more positively, that we must be doing something right. But those are the things that we have to consider. What things could we be doing to really enhance some of these populations, because we're seeing such declines. So another cool thing that we saw also on Sandhills Game Lands was this Anthidium species. This is a type of wool carder bee. Netted a lot of these in 2019. But the really interesting thing is that when this bee is caught in other areas across the state, so there is some PhD work that's happening at NC State now at various research stations across the state and other areas, whenever they caught this particular species of Anthidium, they always caught this non-native invasive version with it. So basically what I'm saying is that this native version of the wool carder bee was never present without the non-native invasive species with it. And so on Sandhills, I never saw the non-native version. I only ever saw the native version. So it was really cool to know that we haven't been infiltrated, at least, because everywhere else across the state, we made a really concerted effort to talk to folks that were doing this collecting, and everybody else was seeing that non-native version, but we weren't. So that was pretty neat. This species right here was caught up in 2019 up at Sandy Mush, and we do think that this actually is a state record. We're still confirming that, but nobody else has any records of this species. So Lasioglossum, this is a type of ground nesting sweat bee. They're really small, they're really non-distinct. The interesting thing about this genus is that they like to throw themselves into the bee bowls. And so I didn't mention this before, but the reason that we're doing the bowls and the netting is because doing one without the other, you miss a subset of the specimens of the data that's out there. So there are certain species that it's really likely to catch them in the bee bowls, but there are certain bee species like bumblebees that almost never drop into a bee bowl. And likewise, with these little Lasioglossum, these sweat bees, they're really small. And so it's really hard to see them on the flower and to catch them in a net. So if we didn't have the bee bowls out, then we would probably miss these guys, and we probably would have missed this one. So we're pretty excited to see the state record. I put this picture in here too, because look at these giant mandibles. That's crazy, right? On this little tiny bee, but they're really not that large. It's just the intensity of this photo, but I thought it was a fun angle. Okay, and then the last thing I'm going to talk about, up at the Piedmont site at the Butner Falls of Neuse Game Land in 2019, at the most recently burned site, they caught this lemon cuckoo bumblebee. So this guy does have its own common name. The interesting thing about this bee, they're declining across the state, across the country, actually, because bumblebees are declining across the country, and this is a parasitic bee. So basically, this bee doesn't collect pollen and nectar for its young. It doesn't create colonies, or like some of the solitary bees, it doesn't excavate little tunnels. It basically will go into another colony and lay its eggs with the eggs of the other bumblebees. So it's a pretty interesting bee, has really interesting behaviors, but they're declining and we haven't seen very many at all. So it was really exciting to see this species up at Piedmont where it was netted. So some final observations for 2019. These 5 species were present at all sites during the 2019 field season. So not surprising, honeybee, not surprising, common eastern bumblebee. I just mentioned that most bumblebees were declining across the country, but the common eastern bumblebee is the one species that's not. So you might want to think about it, I don't know, like as the mockingbird of the bee world, doing really well, kind of taking over as the other bumblebee species are declining. This species is expanding its range. Carpenter bees, everybody really dislikes carpenter bees, but they're really good pollinators actually, and they have really interesting habits and foraging behavior. So it's kind of fun to watch them out in the woods, but they're pretty widespread. And then these 2 species of leafcutter bees, they do not have their own individual common name, but they do have their individual scientific name. And we did see those across all 4 sites. And then species that were unique to each game land during the 2019 field season. You can see again, Sandy Mush had the most, which is really interesting because Sandy Mush had, I think, 4 to 5 less visits than all of the other regions did. Sandhills is next at 19, then Butner at 11, and Holly Shelter at 9. And then in total, in 2019, total species collected 122. That's a little bit on the low side, but we missed those spring season, those spring months. And so I think that explains why the diversity is kind of low. So again, we're really looking forward to getting into that 2020 data. And we're in our 2021 field season now. So hopefully in a few years, maybe I'll come back and I'll be able to put all of this data together and we can see what we're looking at. So I'm going to end my presentation with some really fun pictures that Missy McGaw took when she was out in the field with me last year, just to really drive home the point and illustrate how diverse and beautiful some of these native bees are. So this is a green metallic sweat bee, but this is also a sweat bee. So you can see the difference in size, the difference in color. The difference in behaviors, which you'll notice when you're out in the field watching them. But these guys right here, this is in the genus I was telling you about, that if they see a bee bowl, man, they will throw themselves in there. It's crazy how many you'll get into the bee bowl. This is the leafcutter bee that I was just telling you about. So these guys, they don't collect, I should say girls, because guys don't collect pollen for their young because they don't lay the eggs and prepare the pollen ball for the young. But the females, they have all these pollen collecting hairs on their abdomen. I don't know how well you can see that, but see how it's kind of furry right there. Whereas sweat bees, they have all their pollen collecting hairs on their legs, but these have it on their abdomen. This is a cuckoo leafcutter bee. So cuckoo bees are parasitic. Like I was saying before, they will sneak in and lay their eggs in the burrow or colony of another bee. And so what's interesting to note about this one is that you see how there is no hair anywhere, and they don't need it because they're not collecting pollen for their brood. So they're pretty bare, and a lot of people sometimes will confuse these with wasps just because wasps don't really have pollen collecting hairs either. But the distinguishing feature of a lot of cuckoo bees is this straight pointy abdomen, whereas most bees have rounded abdomens. This is a queen common eastern bumblebee. She's huge. If you're out in the woods now, you're probably starting to see worker bees, but if you're out in the woods in April, late March, beginning of May, and you see a bumblebee, you're probably going to see a queen, and she's going to be huge. She's going to be like a little helicopter all flying around you. They're really, really large. This is a carpenter bee, so you can see there is pollen on this bee everywhere, on its abdomen, on its legs, on its head. So people like to give carpenter bees a hard time, but they really are quite good pollinators. This is a small carpenter bee. So different genus, but same family. But you can see the difference in size. These small carpenter bees are actually really pretty because they have this green tint about them, but they also, like the large carpenter bees, they nest in wood. And then this is a sunflower bee. So you can see where she collects her pollen. She has these very, very hairy legs. So when she is full of pollen, you can barely even see the form, the structure of a leg, because it's just this one big blob. With that, I'm done, and I will take any questions that anybody has.
Excellent. Thanks, Gabriella. If anybody has any questions, if you will, put them in the chat, and we'll go through those. I guess I'll start you off with one, and that is, we hear a lot about pollinator management, and it seems, at least from my perspective, a lot of folks are focusing on butterflies and other things. With so much of North Carolina being privately owned, what would be the primary recommendation you would give for a landowner, homeowner, to promote pollinators in general, but bees specifically?
Well, so outreach is really important, right? And so with this group, the Pollinator Conservation Alliance, there was a big impetus for outreach because I think people want to create quote unquote pollinator habitat. That's such a buzzword right now, but they don't know how to do it, or they think they know how to do it and they're doing it the wrong way. So, there are two things that bees need. They need forage, and they need shelter, or they need habitat. And so I would suggest to a landowner that they plant native plants, the right kind of plants, and that they leave ample habitat so that these bees can nest. And so we have all these plant lists, and there's always the encouragement of having at least 3 plant species per bloom period, so spring, summer, fall, because I think some of the more popular species are the summer blooming flowers, which are really great, but you have these bees that emerge in the spring and they need forage right away, especially you're talking about the queen bumblebees, because without forage, she can't start laying eggs to create her colony. And then in the fall, that's equally as important because you have a lot of these bees that are still above the ground and are trying to bulk up. So having those 3 bloom periods covered is really important, but also having the habitat present so that they can nest is equally important. So having bare ground so that they can put their burrows, because they can't burrow through turf grass. Bee hotels are really popular right now, and I have really mixed feelings about bee hotels just because they're sort of like bird feeders in a sense, right? They're this centralized area that has some benefit, but also invites a lot of bacteria. And it all, with bee hotels, you can't, unless you change out those tubes in the bee hotels every year, they collect bacteria and dirt. They attract a lot of attention from predators like wasps. I have seen bee hotels where the wasps are just hanging around waiting for the bees to emerge because it's a centralized area of activity. So I would say, instead of bee hotels, create that habitat in your yard. So in the fall, we always encourage people to leave their gardens messy. So don't cut back all the stems, because those stems are areas where bees like to nest. So like elderberry, sumac, blackberry are all really good plants that have those nice pithy stems so that the bees can burrow in, tunnel in. Having dead standing wood is really important for carpenter bees, for other stem nesting bees, because they'll go in and use a burrowed out hole that a beetle has created. A lot of our leaf cutting bees will do that. So leaving those kinds of things around your yard. And, even if you want to cut back your stems, so I usually leave all my stems standing over the winter. I leave all the leaf piles. That's more for butterflies, but sometimes the queen bumblebees will find a little hidey hole under a leaf pile. But in the spring, when we do start cutting back our stems, leave a stubble, like leave a foot or so of stubble so that some of the bees that are going down this spring can use those for nesting habitat. Or what you can do too, what I've done this year is when I cut back my stems, I left about a foot stubble, but then I took those other stems and I put them in my backyard and I created kind of a hedgerow of stems so that they can be used again if they need to be. So I think there are a lot of things that you can do in your yard that are more natural as opposed to creating bee hotels. So in a nutshell, forage and shelter, those are the 2 most important things to remember for bees that I would tell landowners about. That was a really long-winded answer.
All right, that's great. You got, here's another question. Would your sampling methods also be able to potentially collect samples of bees that may feed higher up in the forest structure, like on tulip poplars?
Yes. So actually, trees are one of the most important forage sources in the spring, right? And actually, I may have to, what was the first part of that question again?
Would your sampling methods also be able to potentially collect samples of bees that may feed higher up in the forest structure, like on tulip poplars?
Yep. Okay. So I see what you're driving at with that question. Yep. So a lot of times in the spring, the bees and the butterflies, really anything that's out, they're going to be higher up in the canopy because that's where the forage are. You know, the maples, the willows, the tulip poplars, and so it is harder sometimes to catch that those species because they may not come down. And so that's why we really always promote planting species, perennials that are spring blooming, because the trees provide a really important source of forage, but we also need more than just the trees forage. We need more plant level forage, bushes, shrubs, that kind of thing. So I do think that we probably miss some of the species that are staying up in the trees, but they have to come down too, right? Because the females are starting to make their nest. The females are only up above the ground for 2 or 3 weeks. So forage is important, but they're also coming back down to the ground to create their burrows in the ground, or they're finding their stems that are usually at shrub bush level. So I think that we're probably doing an okay job of catching those, even if they are foraging up in the trees, because there's a lot of up and down that they have to do.
Okay. Next question is, will the voucher specimens be placed in the NCSU collection?
Yes, they're going to take some of the specimens. We're going to keep some of the specimens, and we're giving some of the specimens to the Museum of Natural Sciences. So we're going to try to distribute so that everybody has a little bit of what we're catching on the game lands. But we're also keeping really good records. So even if we don't have some of those specimens at WRC, we know where to find them.
Okay. Is there a good way to encourage carpenter bees to burrow places other than home sidings or decks?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and a really popular question too. So there are some entomologists at NC State that are looking at that question right now. There's actually one study. They started this 2 years ago, I believe. They created these benches, just regular benches that you would see in the park that you would sit on, and they made them from several different types of wood. Some of the wood is treated, some of it's not treated, some of it's painted, and they're trying to see if there is a particular type of wood or untreated wood that the carpenter bees tend to like more than other. Because at this point, we're really not seeing any pattern of what they like versus what they don't like. I've heard that people say if you treat the wood or paint it, they won't excavate. That's not true. I've heard a lot of different things, and I haven't seen any pattern or anything in specific that seems to stop them. And I will tell you this, because this is interesting. Out on Sandhills Game Lands, we have those kiosks, right? All the game lands have kiosks. And so there's this kiosk out in one portion of Sandhills, and it has been torn up by carpenter bees. And we're surrounded by thousands of acres of woods, but they honed in on that kiosk. So it's really interesting. There's no rhyme or reason for why they do what they do. But conversely, we've tracked them. So there's also studies going on right now as well, down here from NC State entomologists, where they're putting little backpack trackers on the carpenter bees, on the females, to see where they're going, where their natural nest habitat is. And they're nesting really high up in trees and dead limbs coming off of trees. So, I wish I could give you a better answer. We're also in that study, they're also trying to see how much the carpenter bee excavates before a structure becomes unstable, because I think that's a concern too. My decks have been eaten up by carpenter bees. So a lot of good research happening right now. Stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have some answers to some of those questions, but they're really good pollinators. So if you get frustrated, at least try to remember that. I wish I had a better answer.
All right. And the last question, is it possible to move some of the specimens to the regional education specialist to use in educational programs?
Yeah, absolutely. So because you saw from those figures that I did show you, we're catching a lot of specimens. So I think we can certainly make some, I've started making for my own outreach purposes, those really nice glass cases where you can flip up the lid and it has the label and the tag of where the bee was found and what the species is, and the bee is pinned. And if people are really careful, they can take the pin out and they can use like a little lens to look at some of the characteristics. So certainly, I think that if you contact me, then we can talk about some of the specimens you might want and how to display it. I think that would be great.
All right, great. With that, we're right at 12 noon, so I'm gonna cut it off there. But I'll just say again, Gabriella, thank you very much for a really great presentation. That's some very innovative work that not only spans multiple species, of course, but also pulls together folks in different divisions to collaborate internally, and then also pulls together all of those external collaborators that you mentioned as well. So thanks again for doing that. I appreciate everybody being here. That it will be posted again on our YouTube channel and our website here within the next few weeks. And with that, I'm going to cut it off and just tell everybody I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.